The prairie slept beneath a sky of cold silver, the moon hanging low over the barren hills like a lonely lantern forgotten by God himself. The wind whispered through the cottonwoods, rattling the shutters of the McCrae ranch house. Inside, the only light came from a single oil lamp burning low on the kitchen table, where John McCrae sat hunched forward, his elbows on his knees, his rough hands rubbing his face as his infant son wailed in the crib beside him. It had been 3 months since Mary died. 3 months since fever had taken the laughter out of the house and left him with this tiny bundle of lungs and tears. He had tried everything. Milk warmed on the stove, lullabies whispered through the ache in his throat, but nothing quieted the boy for long. Outside, the coyotes sang like ghosts of old regrets, and inside, John felt like one of them, howling at things he could never bring back. Then came the knock, a sharp, sudden rap against the wooden door that cut through the night like a gunshot. John stiffened, the baby startled into a new round of cries. No one came calling at this hour, not out here where the nearest neighbor was 5 miles away. He reached instinctively for the rifle leaning by the hearth, cradled it against his arm, and stepped to the door. The knock came again, softer this time, almost hesitant. "Who's there?" he barked. A woman's voice answered, trembling but clear. "Please, sir, I'm looking for work. I saw your lamp." John frowned. "Work? At midnight?" He cracked the door open an inch, the barrel of his rifle glinting in the lamplight. Outside stood a young woman in a worn shawl, her hair plastered to her face from the wind. She couldn't have been more than 20. Her shoes were caked with dust, her eyes rimmed with exhaustion. "I can cook, clean, care for the child," she said quickly, as if she'd practiced the words 100 times on the road. "Just a chance, sir. I've nowhere else to go." For a long moment, John said nothing. The baby cried harder, and something in the woman's face softened in sympathy. She stepped closer to the door. "Please, I can help." John lowered the rifle, sighed, and opened the door wide. "Come in, then." She entered quietly, grateful for the warmth. The smell of wood smoke and baby powder wrapped around her as she stood uncertainly near the table. "Name's John McCrae," he said gruffly, setting the rifle aside. "That there's Samuel." "I'm Lydia," she replied, voice small. Lydia Hart. The baby's cries drew her to the crib almost instinctively. She reached down, her hands gentle but sure, and lifted the boy. To John's astonishment, Samuel's sobs slowed, then faded to soft hiccups against her shoulder. Lydia hummed under her breath, an old lullaby, low and soothing. The house seemed to breathe again. John poured her a cup of coffee. "Where'd you come from, Miss Hart?" "Nowhere worth remembering," she said, eyes fixed on the sleeping child. "A town south of here. I worked in a boarding house until the owner's son decided I was part of the rent." Her voice cracked but she straightened her shoulders. "So I left." John looked at her for a long time. He saw the thinness of her arms, the torn hem of her dress, the courage it must have taken to knock on a stranger's door at midnight. "You can stay," he said finally. "For now," she whispered, "thank you." The days that followed settled into a fragile rhythm. Lydia rose before dawn to stoke the fire and warm milk for the baby. She mended Samuel's blankets, scrubbed the floors, and cooked meals that smelled faintly of home. John watched her move through the house like sunlight after a long winter, quiet, steady, never asking for more than a task to fill her hands. Sometimes he'd catch her gazing out at the hills, her expression unreadable. Once, when a thunderstorm rolled in and Samuel cried, she clutched the child tight and whispered, "Hush now, little one. The thunder can't find us here." The way she said it made John wonder what storms she'd known. He began to speak again, small things at first, about the cattle that needed branding, the fence that needed mending. She listened, always with that patient calm that made him feel less alone. And sometimes, at night, when Samuel slept and the house was quiet, he'd find her by the window staring at the stars. "You should rest," he'd say. "I will," she'd answer, without turning. I just like to remember there's something beautiful still shining out there. John didn't press her. He knew what it was to remember. Weeks turned into a month. Lydia's presence softened the house in ways John hadn't thought possible. The baby laughed now. The room smelled of bread and clean linen. Even John caught himself humming as he worked the fields. Yet beneath the peace lingered a question he couldn't shake. Who exactly was Lydia Hart, and what drove her to his door that night? One afternoon, as they worked side by side hanging laundry, a horseman appeared on the ridge. Lydia froze, the color draining from her face. The man wore a black coat, his eyes scanning the valley before turning his horse back toward the horizon. John saw her trembling hands. You know him. She shook her head too quickly. No, just thought. He looked like someone. But that night she barely ate, and when she thought John wasn't looking, she slipped outside, standing in the dark with her shawl pulled tight, staring toward the distant hills. John followed quietly. You running from someone, Lydia? Her breath caught. Does it matter? I'm here. I work hard. I harm no one. It matters if danger follows. She met his eyes then, and in that moment he saw more than fear. He saw guilt, and heartbreak. I didn't steal, she whispered. I didn't kill. But a man like him doesn't need truth to ruin a woman. He wanted to ask more, but Samuel's cry from inside broke the silence. She turned and hurried in, leaving John under the wide, cold sky, wondering what secrets the night had brought into his home. 2 nights later, the knock came again. It was near midnight once more. The fire had burned low, and John was half asleep in his chair when the sound jolted him upright. Lydia stood in the hallway, pale, clutching Samuel close. Don't open it, she breathed. But John was already reaching for his rifle. The door burst inward before he could reach it. 3 men filled the doorway, faces shadowed, spurs clinking. The one in front wore a black coat, the same man from the ridge. Evening, McRae, he drawled. Name's Collins, Sheriff Collins. I'm looking for a runaway. His eyes slid to Lydia. There she is. Lydia backed away, clutching the baby tighter. You've no right. She's wanted for theft, the sheriff interrupted. Stole from her employer and fled. I'm taking her back. John stepped between them. She works for me now. You got proof? Collins smiled thinly. Plenty. But you can save yourself trouble by stepping aside. John's grip tightened on the rifle. She's not going anywhere tonight. Tension thickened like smoke. The men shifted, hands on their holsters. Lydia's breath hitched. Samuel began to wail. The sheriff's smile vanished. You don't want to cross me, rancher. Then leave, John said evenly. Or you'll find out how serious I am. For a heartbeat, no one moved. Then Collins spat on the floor and jerked his head at his men. We'll be back come morning, with papers. They turned and rode into the darkness. John shut the door and bolted it. Lydia was shaking. You shouldn't have done that, she whispered. I won't hand over. Someone who saved my son's life, he said simply. Her eyes filled with tears. You don't even know me. Then tell me, he said. All of it. She sank into a chair, clutching Samuel like a shield. The man I worked for wasn't just cruel, he was dangerous. He wanted me for himself, and when I refused, he called me a thief. I ran with nothing but what I wore. Her voice broke. If he finds me, he'll drag me back and make it true. John's jaw hardened. Then he'll have to come through me. The lamp flickered between them, throwing shadows across their faces. Outside, the wind rose again, carrying the promise of trouble with the dawn. But in that fragile silence, something else took root, trust, small and trembling, like the first green shoot after fire. And for the first time since Mary's death, John McRae looked across the table and felt the faintest pulse of hope. The night after the sheriff's visit was a restless one. The wind howled through the canyon like a wounded beast, shaking the shutters and rattling the tin roof. John sat by the fire, rifle laid across his knees, while Lydia paced with Samuel in her arms, whispering lullabies that trembled with fear. Neither spoke much. Words felt too small for what loomed beyond the walls. The promise of confrontation, of justice or ruin, no one could tell which. When the first pale fingers of dawn brushed the horizon, John rose and poured coffee into 2 cups. Lydia took hers with shaking hands. "You could still send me away," she whispered. "Say I left in the night. They'd never blame you." John looked at her over the rim of his cup. "And have that child grow up thinking his father turned away a woman in need. No, Miss Hart, that's not the kind of man I aim to be." Lydia's eyes filled, but she said nothing more. By mid-morning, they heard hooves. 3 riders again, dust rising behind them like smoke. The sheriff rode in front, papers clutched in his gloved hand, a sneer already curling on his lips. "Told you I'd be back," he said. "Got my warrant right here." John stepped down from the porch, the rifle slung casually in his arm. "That paper signed by a judge, or by your own hand?" "Signed enough for my purpose," Collins replied. He nodded to his men. "Take her," Lydia cried out as they started forward, but John raised the rifle. "You take one more step, and this yard becomes your grave." His voice was low, steady, the voice of a man who'd fought wars and buried dreams. The sheriff hesitated. "You threatening the law, McCrae?" "I'm protecting my home. You bring me proof, real proof, then we'll talk. Until then, you leave." Collins sneered, but something in John's eyes made him falter. "You'll regret this," he spat, turning his horse sharply. "No one defies me twice." He and his men thundered off toward town, leaving a cloud of dust and dread behind. Lydia sank onto the porch steps, clutching Samuel close, tears streaking her cheeks. "He won't stop," she said softly. "He'll come back with more men. He'll ruin you." John knelt beside her, his rough hand resting gently on her shoulder. "Let him come," he said. "I've buried worse men than him. But I won't bury another innocent soul because the world turned its back." Dash dash dash. The day crawled by under a heavy sky. Storm clouds gathered on the horizon, rolling like dark waves over the plains. John worked in silence, checking his fences, securing the livestock, always keeping one eye on the distant road. Lydia helped as best she could, her hands busy though her thoughts wandered far. As dusk fell, the storm broke, rain slashing sideways, lightning clawing at the sky. Thunder cracked so loud it shook the windows. Samuel wailed, frightened, and Lydia held him tight by the fire. Then came the sound they both dreaded, hoofbeats, faint but distinct through the roar of rain. John's head snapped up. "Stay inside," he ordered. "Lock the back door." "John, do it, Lydia." He stepped out into the downpour, rifle ready. Lightning flashed, and in that white blaze he saw them. 6 riders this time, the sheriff leading, his face twisted with fury. "McCrae," Collins shouted through the rain. "You had your chance. Now step aside." John stood his ground. "You want her, you come through me." The thunder swallowed their voices as the men dismounted, guns drawn. The world became noise and light and fear. Lydia, watching from the window, saw John move, swift, sure, fearless. A warning shot cracked into the sky. One of the sheriff's men returned fire, the bullet splintering wood beside John's shoulder. "Stop!" Lydia screamed, running into the storm, Samuel wailing in her arms. "Stop this!" The sight of her, hair whipping, shawl soaked, the child crying, made even the rain hesitate. John turned to her, fury and fear warring in his eyes. "Get back inside." But it was too late. Collins seized her arm, yanking her forward. "You want her so bad, McCrae. Then watch what happens to your little saint." He drew his pistol, but before he could raise it, John fired. The crack echoed across the plains, louder than thunder. Collins staggered, dropped his gun, and fell into the mud. The other men froze. The storm raged, and in that silence of lightning and death, they saw what kind of man they faced. One by one, they backed away, mounted their horses, and rode off into the dark. John dropped the rifle, chest heaving. Lydia fell to her knees beside the sheriff's still body, rain washing the blood from his coat. You killed him, she whispered, not in horror but disbelief. He left me no choice, John said quietly. She looked up at him then. This man who had risked everything for a woman he barely knew. He would have ruined you, she said. He shook his head. He would have ruined us both if I'd done nothing. She rose, still trembling, and for a long moment they stood in the rain, the baby between them, the storm breaking overhead. Then she leaned forward, pressing her forehead to his chest, and the dam inside her broke. All the fear, all the shame, all the loneliness poured out in sobs that mingled with the rain. John wrapped his arms around her, holding her steady, holding them all. Dash dash dash. Morning came soft and golden, as if the world itself wanted to forget the night before. The sheriff's body was gone, buried beneath the cottonwoods by the creek. John said a prayer, not for the man he'd killed, but for the peace he hoped would follow. The law came, of course. Questions were asked. But when the townsfolk heard how Collins had hounded a woman across counties for rejecting him, how John McCrae had stood his ground, the whispers turned to respect. No charges were pressed. The ranch returned to quiet. Weeks passed. The land healed. So did they. Lydia still carried her past like a scar, visible only when the light hit just right, but the weight of it grew lighter each day. She laughed now, truly laughed, and her laughter filled the rooms where once only silence lived. Samuel grew strong, chasing chickens across the yard while John and Lydia watched from the porch. One evening, as the sun bled red across the sky, John turned to her. "You know, this house feels different now," he said. She smiled faintly. "How so?" "It feels alive again." She looked at him, her eyes soft with something deeper than gratitude. "It's not the house, John. It's us." He reached for her hand, calloused and small in his own. "You ever think about staying? Not as a worker, but as family?" Her breath caught. For a moment she said nothing. Then, slowly, she nodded. "If you'll have me." He smiled, a real smile, one that reached his tired eyes. "I already do." The last light of day touched their faces, warm and golden, as Samuel toddled between them, giggling. The wind carried the scent of rain, wet earth and blooming sage. Somewhere far off, the coyotes began to sing again, not of loss this time, but of life continuing. And for the first time in years, John McCrae felt the ache inside him quiet. The house that had once echoed with grief now pulsed with laughter, warmth, and the fragile, powerful promise of love.